Congrats on making it through the semester. Woo! Round of applause. This is your last and I think should be really fun thing. So you are almost there. A couple of notes. So as I've said, I sent an email, so you have some information just with some final kind of details in there. But we should have the recording of tonight's lecture online within 2 days, my staff has told me. So I'm going to give you a week from there to submit any remaining makeup assignments, so you have a little bit of extra time. So Wednesday, December 18th at midnight will be the final deadline for any makeup assignments, documentation, whatever else. So please make note of that. Make sure to get everything in by then. I won't be able to extend that, so please make sure that anything that you want credit for, you are sending in by then. Please also try to put Art 200 in the subject line if possible. I get a lot of emails. We have a large group, as you can imagine, so that really helps me stay organized and try not to miss anything. So please put that in the subject line. That helps a lot. The exciting news, you will all be happy to learn. I'm going to give everyone a half-letter grade bump. Yay! Okay, so if you have one late, it will disappear. If you have one absence, it will turn into a late, et cetera, so you can factor that into any makeup work plans and calculations. I hope you'll still do makeup assignments and watch the recordings if you did miss lectures, since they've all been great. I should also add in the email as well, sadly, due to a technical glitch, we lost the recording of Sarah Beery Moses' lecture a couple of weeks ago. I'm so sorry about it, because for folks who were here, it was a great lecture. So if you are doing a makeup assignment for that date, November 25th, I believe, I've sent the alternative instructions, and it's also in Brightspace in the makeup assignment module, but you are going to read a couple of his articles instead and write a brief response to those, okay? So that's the alternative for that date, because unfortunately you can't watch that lecture, I'm very sorry to say. Okay, so let's jump in. We would like to acknowledge the land on which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Gracelee Lawrence with us, and Gracelee will be introduced by our fabulous grad student and maybe even instructor of some of your classes, H. Boone. So please join me in welcoming H to the stage.
And it's been awesome watching her sculptures evolve since then. The way she plays with possibilities of technology and 3D printing has been a huge inspiration for my own art practice. I'm glad they were able to come here as part of the lecture series, and grateful I had the opportunity to talk with her about my work earlier today. Her work explores relationships between food, the body, and technology, residing in the intersection of physical and digital reality. Their art examines how bodies are gendered and fragmented through capitalist desires, physical sustenance, and digital spaces. Working from 3D scans of her own body and various plant and fruit forms, the resulting works are glitchy, distorted, and complicate their identification. Gracelee has participated in 20 residencies globally and had their second solo show at Postmasters in New York in June 2022, praised by Roberta Smith in the New York Times. Smith wrote that Lawrence ingeniously exploits her small 3D printers and describes her work as mouthwatering, gorgeous, and covetable. Currently, Gracelee is the head of the sculpture area at the University at Albany, SUNY, Recent exhibitions include Peter Gaugy in Vienna, Prior Art Space in Barcelona, and Kavi Gupta in Chicago. They have installed outdoor sculptures in locations such as Wave Hill in the Bronx and Franconia Sculpture Park in Minnesota. They were a visiting professor at Chiang Mai University on the Luce Scholars Fellowship and are a member of Material Girls. Beyond art, Gracelee is an avid dancer, lifelong equestrian, and dedicated gardener. Please join me in welcoming Gracelee Lawrence.
Hello. So glad to see all of you this evening. I hope that this will be a fun and exciting last class of the semester for you. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, H. I really appreciate it, and to everyone who made it possible for me to be here. I am going to begin by talking about the poetics behind my work. So we'll kind of talk about my work in a couple of different phases and methods that bring it all together in the end. Also, can everyone hear me okay? Yes, yes, yes? Okay. Also, please don't be on your phones because I'm here so present with you. So please be present with me as well. Okay? Great. So I'm going to start with poetics, and I start with this because I want to approach these systems and structures of my work more laterally, and a poetic approach allows me to lay this foundation that then you can understand the finished products through. So instead of a linear view, this allows for a greater elasticity and oblique connection point. And so, with those foundations laid, let's begin. These are not living bodies or fruits ripening to only bruise and rot. These are fictive appendages and globular organic structures. Fingernails are not growing, sap is not running. They are mirrors of my experience, abstractions of relationships mediated by digital space, of how I perceive the world, quickening in its technological progressions and its emotional effects. They're ruled by touch. My own, their boundaries to one another, cracked and screwed and glued and sanded. Print touching print, chemicals touching surface, and of course, I'm touching it all. Within my processes, there are of course ironies of pressing the soft, oozing, messy nature of bodies and plants through the harsh and unyielding geometries of digital space. And even if you cannot see the hundreds of thousands of triangles that make up an object, they're present, always slightly shifting the underpinnings of the form. Their varied densities interact and curl in and out of each other in seamless unions. And this translation to the geometric makes for a skew, a flattening and smoothing. Digital life is always cleaner than our corporeal mess. And as we all know, in life, there's always more lurking just beneath the surface. But just as nothing is exactly as it appears, it also appears that nothing is unsoiled. But regardless of what lies beneath, how can logical science, the invariable coordinates of the Cartesian grid, lend truth to raw emotion? There is no pure sensation. Everything is tainted by context, experience. These things are shells to hold sensation, translated into object form, or perhaps, more aptly, mirrors with a different kind of refraction. And while the boundaries of the grid hold the forms within the orthogonal, the conditions and connections in the physical world make a web of entangled sense memories. In my spaces, boundaries are merged. A banana turns into a finger, my body becomes a vegetal mass, asparagus fingertips across the gallery. The biocyborgs emerge in their fragmented, bulbous forms. But underneath, they're still regulated by these geometries and their inflexible rules. But you may be wondering, how can an object hold sensation? And I answer that through touch and translation, data gain and loss, the erosion and addition of zeros and ones. On the left, I'm holding myself, scanned, archived, made into a file. I can email myself. On the right, Rachel holds my copper fingers while Cameron takes a picture, flattening the dimensionality and responsiveness to screen space, while I did the same thing, a few inches further back. But back to the context of these objects, you feel this thing differently if you've ever eaten a banana. If you felt the clammy peel in your hand, so much like human skin, equally delicate and prone to showing the marks of its age and movements in the world. If you've peeled back the leaves of a cabbage like the petals of a flower, cupped your hand around the warmth of another person. They're all little mirrors. and the mirror reflects and refracts oneself, creating an image of who we think we are. There's an exhibitionism inherent in our moment of digital proliferation, a constant need to measure one's own digital refraction, which some of you, in fact, may be doing right now. How does this change desire? How does it shift fear and fantasy? Not to mention that eggplants will never be the same again. And of course, neither will my work. These things are sexless, as dead things, and yet they're filled with gender. There's a historical link to sexual desire in art making. Just look at all those modernist guys. You got Picasso, Matisse, Monet. Their abstract expressionist descendants like de Kooning and Pollock. And while I absolutely do not look to these men for guidance in art or life, they are historically a part of the foundation of contemporary art, the field in which I exist. Gender and power is excessively present in their work, and the directionality of desire, in the case of those examples, is a clear male to female linearity. But I want to cut up that idea. Sever those lines, tangle them, confuse or joke or twist these historicized binaries. But desire, sex, that feels a little bit too simple. Erotics feel more apt. The erotic has been misnamed by men and used against women, says Audre Lorde in Uses of the Erotic. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, psychotic, or plasticized sensation. The notion of the erotic implies the uncontrollable draw of our bodies to something larger, being in relation, calling the inner life into play. And a part of my interest in this use, the word erotic specifically, stems from these historically masculine traditions I'm working to squeeze out of existence, this desire to make a softer, more plastic world. And in the process, I find myself thinking about the embryonic, translucent resin suspended in a gelatinous mass, or a vat of resin, prints slowly coming into the world layer by layer. The process feels delicate, even tender. Once the surrounding material has been scraped away, it's the first time that this encased object has ever existed in our own dimensional world. And at first, that removal is done with great care. But soon the newness wears off. I begin to touch them like a person I know, a material intimacy that grows over time. No longer timid, I think I understand the boundaries. And in boundaries, there's this relationship to the shell, the egg, simultaneously a protective barrier and a vessel, but more than that, a mirror. And while the excavation is embryonic, the gestation is anything but organic. Linear, Cartesian, layer by layer, built with toxic chemicals and UV light, thermoplastic and heat, but still, it's making solids from liquids. And in that, there is an unlikeliness to some of these objects, a hole they fill in my sculptor brain, not easily cast or hand-carved. Their translucence and delicacy makes them feel like tiny organs or jewels, but also ghosts, which makes sense, as I often think of 3D scans as ghosts. But these ghosts, specifically, they manage to become real, in a physical sense, invading more than just screen space. They're forced through several more translations, a scattered point cloud of information, to triangles, to a line code read by a 3D printer, and then extruded into our world, with, of course, varying degrees of accuracy. And once they arrive, liberated from digital sterility, they are subject to the aggressions of touch, dust, holding, pretending, feeling, breaking, sticking, smoothing, longing, polishing, caring, aching, caressing, breaking, building, cracking, aging, etc. All of these actions that we ourselves cannot escape. But there's also some kind of excavationist and additive mothering in this messiness. I'm forcing my own will along with gravity's relentlessness onto these digitally conceived forms. And honestly, they're pretty materially ill-equipped to exist. They're ill-prepared. So I prop, I glue, I sand, I press to fortify them. But above all others, the form that I continually capture is my own body, again and again, scan, archive, to try to know myself better, or maybe capture different facets. I tear myself apart and put her back together. And here you see 2 scans of the same arm, from 5 years apart. But my question to you is, are they the same? And that really depends on your conception of the digital and your definition of real. In digital space, time can expand or contract, or even circle back around onto itself in the same way that identity can be expanded or exploded or completely shrouded, allowing the person to become someone else. Space can be amplified and extended to become unknowably vast or compressed so that the entire universe fits onto a pinhead. And from time to time, we are faced with the inevitability of the physical realm. Bodily disease, extreme weather, they make us feel like our digital selves are inert or impotent or inadequate. Digital space is still considered by most people to be a place of escape, which is quite complicated as the average adult American spends over 7 hours per day on their phones. And that's not to mention the rest of the screen time that's in there. So it's become this both completely normalized and quotidian activity while still operating in this space of exception, which is a complicated combination. And while digital space is not a novelty at this point in time, it's treated much more like a distraction than what it truly is, which is a place we travel to, if only with our eyes and minds. In my work, I'm asking, can we embody digitalness? Can our bodies withstand this torsion of translation? Can we truly step into the mirage with our eyes open? And with that, I'll move on to production. So with that poetic context laid, I'll switch gears into production, which is a linear progression, but with good reason. As is the case with many artists, my work is a continual evolution, each exploration building from the last. So you've already figured out, my work is born in this transfigurative space between physical and digital reality, just like we all are, which is one reason why I find my work to be important to me and to others, because we're all existing within this tension between worlds. And I'm interested in imagining more potential fluidities between destructive dualisms, like masculine, feminine, nature, culture, human, animal, digital, analog. And I'm going to start in 2015, long ago. This is work I made for the Umlauf Prize in 2015, which was the first time I responded to place and context in my work. This was a site-specific series of fountains that I made at the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum in Austin, Texas. And I was really interested in actively disrupting this overtly masculine, patriarchal, traditionalist stance of Charles Umlauf's bronze figurative sculptures in the museum's garden. Charles Umlauf is the namesake of the museum. Obviously, was also the first sculpture professor at UT Austin, where I went to grad school. So it was an important conversation for me to be having with this personal lineage of mine. You can see his piece kind of up in the back, and then my revision in the front. So each one of my fountains was placed in proximity to a piece it was responding to. So I was interested in pushing against his heteronormative, hierarchical, stereotypical presentation of bodies, and I was also co-opting his titles for my fountain. So this was further linking my revisionist intentions of how my work would behave. And this was also the first project where I used digital fabrication. And in this case, it allowed me to use image rather than material as metaphor. So prior to this point, I had been using food materials to make my work, so flour, salt, pineapple crowns, juicer pulp, just to name a few. And digital fabrication allowed me to scale the work to previously impossible extremes and consider the accessibility of image in a public setting. And not to mention that those materials would have lasted about 5 seconds in the Texas weather. So I had to pivot. And fruit first entered my work as a material interest, like I mentioned, juicer pulp, pineapple crowns, etc. And that's because there's a linguistic and image-based reciprocation with the body, and also an intrinsic humor. Fruit is used to understand the size of a tumor or a growing fetus. Bananas are constantly invoked in phallic jokes. The peach emoji, great example. And so there's this active reciprocation of language around bodies and plants. To some extent, they're both pruned, grafted, sculpted. They both ripen and decay. And the fountains themselves, I started making them as replications of nature, borrowed from waterfalls, streams, the oasis. They are also related to leisure and regeneration. So fruits and fountains are both linked to pleasure and abundance. But beyond that, it gives the objects a job and a title beyond sculpture, elemental actions that I cannot fully control. And in this work, I first began using scans of the body, both of my own body and from my community. And over time, this has morphed into the creation and maintenance of a huge 1,000+ file 3D scan archive. Kind of charts my path through the world. And in the center of that particular exhibition, which is my thesis exhibition at UT Austin, was this piece, Reclining Nude. This was a fountain that was also based off of a Charles Umlauf sculpture of the same name that was originally installed in that same courtyard. In A Woman Looking at Men Looking at Women, Siri Hustvedt said, "The history of art is full of women lying around naked for erotic consumption by men. These women are mostly unthreatening, aren't they?" Well, this double-ended pineapple, with her spiky crowns and her little fat roll, seemingly she's peeing herself on this lounge chair, there's water coming out from under her, she really disrupts that idea of erotic consumption and brings into question the consumable nature of bodies and fruits. And, lucky for you, this is my first fruit fact of the night, there'll be more to come. In the 17th century, in Europe, a delectable pineapple from the Americas was a great rarity. It was worth more than its weight in gold, and yet now you can go to pretty much any grocery store and get it for a few dollars. So the history of fruits and their relationship to colonialism, distribution, the control of bodies and spaces and resources is also a really important point of research in my process. And each food item that I'm invoking, I've done quite a bit of research in order to understand the way that it's moved throughout the world. Because every food item we have, if it's not grown natively in your area, it's had to get there somehow, and through some hands and some means. Here's my fountain and Umlauf's original bronze, just for reference. So directly after grad school, I received the Luce Scholars Fellowship. I moved to Chiang Mai, Thailand for a year and a half, where I assisted the artist Araya Rasmirjansuk, and I taught in the Contemporary Art Practice Department at Chiang Mai University. That's in Thailand, by the way. And so I began to think about technology and the role of digital fabrication in my work very differently at that time. Technology very quickly became my primary means of connection and support and care while being in a place so far from my previous community. So I was interested in capturing the translation of emotion and empathy through technology. And I began to use the tools available, which were a 3D scanner and a 3D printer that I brought with me, to play with this idea of pressing emotion from digital to physical space and back again. So digital fabrication very quickly became much more than just a means to an end. And this was my setup in Chiang Mai in 2016. This terrible little tiny 3D scanner, my computer, and a printer. That's all I had to work with. My department didn't even have a drill, so literally this is all I had to work with. And so this work is not only dealing with my shifting relationship to technology, but also how my own identity was shifting and changing from immersion in a new social-cultural space. And my own boundaries were shifting as I tried to understand the expectations of being a young professor, a woman, a white American, and much more while living in Thailand. These pieces were in 2 shows in Thailand during my time there, and when I left, the show in Bangkok was still up, and I have no idea where this work is now. I like to imagine it maybe in a stranger's home or forgotten in an alley. Maybe it's still at the gallery, I don't know. But I hope they're still out there doing their work. So not long after I returned to the US, I did a residency at Mary Sky, which is a beautiful property in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And my proposal was chosen in the inaugural year of their initiative to commission a site-specific installation or sculpture from one artist each summer. And so I spent 2 completely solitary weeks on the property, did not see another human being, and left with plans for building this object, A World Without Genesis, which is a gravity flow fountain situated on a copper vein and stream that runs down the mountainside property. There are many, many important details on this piece, but I'll just mention a few. The right arm is turning into a pile of rocks. The copper left hand is holding the slowly dripping bronze banana finger. The right leg, which you'll see in a moment, is becoming a horse leg. There's a chain on the horse leg and water dripping down it. So this fountain absolutely became an accidental self-portrait. I've never intended to make a self-portrait in my life, but it happened accidentally. And I brought 2 texts with me to the mountain. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and Banana, A Global History. Okay, second fruit fact of the night. Lucky you. Bananas are actually the world's largest herb. They're not trees. Don't call them trees. They are categorized as an herbaceous perennial. They're actually related to ginger. Wild, right? The whole tree is edible too. Fun fact. So there's a cyborgian quality to this object. There's a truncation, rearrangement, replacement of human parts with mechanical components. And so that fed into my idea of the biocyborg that I developed while I was on site there, using parts and pieces of the natural world to continue this exploration of this rift, the binaries between nature, culture, biology, technology, and the human. And the purpose of this object is to be connected to the stream itself, as a gravity flow fountain. The patina of the copper and bronze components will change over time. Also, this form is headless in order to attempt to remove intellect and ego, but also as a nod to fragmented classical statuary. This is a video of the installed sculpture. You'll see that the water outflow is very, very gentle. My fountains are rarely supposed to be monumental, aggressive objects, but instead the water acts as an activating force in a small way. So there are 3 output areas. One is at the neck, one is on this banana finger, and then the other one is going down the chain on the horse side. So a gravity flow fountain, in this case, it means there's no electricity on site. You can't even get solar power because it's dense forest. So I built a 2-pool system, and the water pressure from the top pool feeds the fountain. So it's incredibly connected to rain, groundwater, and the site itself. So the flow shifts as the water in the region changes. Another banana fact for you. Bananas are actually locally called hands, and a single banana is called a finger. I did not know that until after I made this banana finger sculpture, but sometimes ideas are just floating around out there and they just pop in your brain. And I was so delighted to learn that a banana finger is an idea that exists in the world already. So this is a preparatory scan of the site using photogrammetry. I love the glitchiness of 3D scans, which is something that I've continued exploring in my work for many, many years. But in this case, because I developed the work on site and then I worked on it quite a bit back in my studio, it was really important for me to actually have a photogrammetry scan of the site so that I could work on the piece from afar. This is another outdoor piece. This is a visual artifact. This was a collaboration with my dear friend and fellow sculptor, Deborah Freelander. This was located in Times Square as a part of the Spring Break Art Fair, Times Square Immersive in March 2019. So actually this piece lived in Times Square for a whole month and is still whole, which is really a miracle. And we thought of this piece as a fantasy core sample of a Times Square from the future. So it has these fluorescent strata interspersed with 3D printed copper of imported fruits, hands, CDs, sneakers, styrofoam cups, and other techno-capitalist artifacts. So we're really thinking about society's relationship to globalized capitalism through a personal and geological lens. And the column's cap is a topographic sample of Manhattan bedrock that I've 3D scanned. And this emergent hand is holding a phone that only has an image of the mountain emoji. Emojis for a while were really important in my work. Go figure. And it's important that the bedrock is on top of this object because bedrock is what allows skyscrapers to be built in certain areas of the city, including Midtown. So the geology is directly affecting the way that the city behaves, even to this day. And of course, there's a little bit of digital humor as well. And this is an inspo shot from a solo show in May 2019 at Thierry Goldberg Gallery. This is called Finger Whip. And the title of the show refers to the optimal moment at which to pick asparagus. So nodding only, well, both to the central sculpture in the exhibition, asparagus fingers, pink ones, and then also the inherent relationships between the body and food and the language that we use to understand them. So it also references one of the rules I used to make the work. There are no areas smaller than a finger width on any of these objects, which if you've ever had to hand sand anything, you'll understand why. These were described as beguilingly creepy and charmingly perverse in a review of The New Yorker, which I feel like were really apt descriptions of my intentions. Each of these pieces kind of held a different emotional space, and I was thinking of them as biocyborg vessels of different emotional states and spaces. So the asparagus clearly is an incredibly confident strutter. Beautiful square nails. She's enjoying her strut around the room. And in 2019, I made this piece. This is Perceived Happiness as the Ultimate Revenge. This was a site-specific fountain. My largest project to date. I did this at Franconia Sculpture Park as a Jerome Fellow. I built this irregularly shaped 21 by 18 foot concrete basin by hand with help with a group. But it was a really wild experience as we didn't have a tractor or any concrete expertise. We were really just free-wheeling it. So in this case, this larger-than-life biocyborg female form is morphing into a bunch of contorted celery. So this concrete pedestal is in the center of a large oval basin, and she's hunched around a creased pillow. It kind of looks like she just woke up. So there's this idea of grief and uncertainty, vulnerability, intimacy, and she's well below eye level, which was really important to me. I wanted to counteract some of these larger, more vertical, monumental sculptures that were in the sculpture park, and instead ask people to come down closer to her to observe this object. So you have to crouch down to look through these leaves and to really observe the way that this sculpture behaves. Water is dripping down the leaves, and it's coming out of the ends of 16 stalks, so she's kind of crying into this basin. And there are also 2 stalks on each side that are spread out kind of like elbows to the side. And this piece is painted a very specific luminescent pale lilac color, and it really changes with the light conditions and the sun. And a fun fact about this color is that it's a stock Mazda color. Anybody can go to any body shop and get whatever you want painted in this color. Lucky you. So you should. Mazda has a really good set of colors from like 2002, so don't sleep on that. And this sculpture, as many of my sculptures are, is really frozen in this moment of tension. And I'm so pleased that this piece is currently at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, and you can visit her there until October 2025. But she doesn't have a basin around her because that was a horrible thing to build. So she's just on her own. You have to imagine her in the water. This is a rendering of the object in Rhino during the planning phase. So you can see, especially with these larger pieces, all the details aren't necessarily worked out. A lot of handwork is happening on the other end. So depending on the end product of the form, there might be more or less refinement in digital space. This is one of the 2 public commissions I did in 2020. This is Provisional Body. This was at Museum of Museums in Seattle, Washington. And this was supposed to be a revision of the myth of Daphne and Apollo, but instead Daphne is turning into celery. So in relationship to that previous form. And this is also the first time I allowed this mottled nature of the underlayment of epoxy putty to be exposed. It makes almost a camouflage pattern, which is a pretty important shift in how I surface my objects and think about pattern, and this formal component of having not just a single mono-painted surface, which led into this piece. Other escapes, the ones you can open in yourself. This was at Wave Hill in the Bronx, and this piece is really deeply exploring the relationship between propagated plants, the body, and technology. So thinking about the connection between humans and the natural world, and particularly the socio-political histories of gardens. Wave Hill is a beautiful garden, both a series of greenhouses and gardens and exhibition spaces in the Bronx. I highly recommend if you're ever down there and you can go visit it. And so on this commission, I decided to make a small outdoor fountain, much smaller, much more reasonably scaled than the last one, thank goodness. And the head of this form is turning into an angel trumpet flower, also known as a Brugantia. So it's drooping towards this basin of water, and a little bit of a reference to Narcissus. And the tail of the being is the extended stem of the plant. So the left arm is almost skimming the surface of the water in the basin. And it was really important that it's an angel trumpet flower because Brugantia is a deadly plant. It's also a hallucinogen. And so its presence in a garden brings into question agency and control, and particularly thinking about the traditionally female-coded space of a flower garden. So the potential deeper meanings and uses of something that would be perceived as ornamental. The title of this piece is lifted from a line in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. This is a little 3D printed maquette of the piece, which is a super useful way for me to understand the form before the final object, which doesn't always happen in large-scale work, but in this case, it was really important to understand the way that the pedestal and the object were relating spatially. So these fragmented bodies that are combined with plants I intend them to be an alternative perspective on technology. So I think about plant life as a form of technology that's softer, less rigid than mammalian and reptilian systems. I mean, most plants, to the human eye at least, are calm and centered and quite literally rooted. And they create symbiotic systems of information sharing between one another. So using waste productively, they're unconcerned with productivity, which is our absolute contemporary human blight. And so in my work, I'm trying to ask, what if we found a softer rather than more rigid state of being? And in this series of work, I'm starting with a 3D scan. I'm processing, in this particular case of this form, and I encourage these cutouts, these cavernous voids, which are really moments where data has lapsed, lack of data. And I'm interested in ceding control to these programs and structures that I'm using. And I'm able to respond to really surprising results in that way. It's not a direct one-to-one. In the case of this piece, there are 45 individual 3D printed forms, and there's an amazing array of potential texture and transparency options of material. And obviously this piece is really unabashedly present with its digital origins. I'm also thinking a lot about patchwork quilts and checkerboard patterns, linoleum floor tiles. And so this formal structure of the grid actually offers quite a complex understanding of the outline of the form and this different type of tracing of the form. In the case of this piece, it's a lower body 3D scan, and then it's been overlaid with various fruit and vegetables. So there's eggplant, jalapeno, sugar apple, strawberry, okra, many, many more inlaid surprises that are within this greater formal context. And so much of this series is about play with materials and pushing these different filaments to new and more complicated stretches. I'm particularly fond of this combination of form and filament. It feels like an oil spill or a dark rainbow, a rotted log, a bowing lichen. And in the case of this piece, it came from this citrus-like texture that arose while I was processing the 3D scan, a complete surprise to me. And then it became a prompt in content and color. So I'm often trying to be responsive to these systems and structures rather than push against them. I mean, all of the technology that I'm using is made by a human. I mean, applications on your computer, they're all made by humans, they're imperfect. So using these moments of slippage and imperfection within the structures often begets fascinating end products. And the boundaries and divisions have become really exciting aspects of these objects. In the piece on the right, I was thinking about the sunrise gradient across the entire form. So often there's a more formal concern, a color concern, conceptual concern, and they kind of triangulate into how the final product behaves. And this is a parallel series. I've been making these digitally derived pedestals for the large-scale versions of the small tabletop 3D printed objects. And the crowning objects are finished with an auto paint, like a pearl finish. And they're meant to also reference digital space, this unlikely refraction of light that often arises in grid mediums. And I find that auto paint has the capacity to collect those refractions in a way that few other paints do. This is a screenshot from a VR sculpting platform that I often use. These are all potential pedestals for a corn sculpture. So corn is really important in my work because it's a direct reference to PLA, polylactic acid, which is a filament that all of my work is made of. PLA is a bioplastic. It's made from fermented corn starches, or fermented plant starches rather, but it's most commonly made from cornstarch. And it's commonly used for 3D printing, food packaging, plastic bags. If you've ever been to a takeout place that has a bioplastic fork or a spoon and it says it can be composted, it's made of PLA, so you have most likely held a PLA object. And it's a really promising alternative to petroleum-based plastics, but it's also not a perfect solution. It's still plastic. It has a super slow rate of biodegradability, though. It takes about 3 months in an environmentally controlled industrial-grade composting environment, or between 100 and 1,000 years to decompose in the landfill, so it's not a quick decomposition. And it also can't be mixed with other plastics. And the whole reason why it exists is because of genetically modified corn. and GMO corn in our agriculture industrial complex and the American landscape. So it's particularly important to me that this PLA filament is directly in conversation with and in reference to the agro-industrial complex that my work is directly speaking to as body and food. The corn itself, in this case, is one single giant 3D print, and in this piece I was thinking about whole beans, anamorphic skull, Hamid Plintz's large-scale skewed body forms. Actually, there's one at the AKG, that big giant marble stack head, a classic sculpture move. And thinking about other ways to handle digitally derived forms. This is a beaded curtain piece. This is lack of permanent connection. And in this case, I started using direct image rather than only mass in making an object. There are over 56,000 individually strung glass and stainless steel beads in this piece. And it begins as actually a VR sculpted environment, a digitally sculpted environment, and then I take screenshots of that environment and translate that into the bead forms, pixel to pixel, an inversion of my most common process. So using digital means to create an object that's fully predicated on physical labor. The image behind, or the image of the curtain will disappear when the object behind is not opaque. So it has this amazing shifty quality in different types of light, and I love the way that it acts as this mirage. It's also important that it's the same materials as computing systems, alumina, steel, silica, etc. So there's this further link. And I really think of these pieces as physical data. You know, one pixel is one bead. So there are these physical, tactile structures of understanding data. This is Fruit Soup. This was a two-person show with Audrey Flack, and each sculpture of mine was living with or beside one of Audrey Flack's photographic prints, and each of these objects is supported by a custom virtual reality sculpted and then 3D printed shelf. So I'm thinking about a core gesture or intention within the sculpture that's then highlighted or extended through the object that it's being supported on. And this is the first iteration of the rotating tabletop that I'll talk about a little bit more. That's shifted into many, many different and important forms. So this was from Art Dubai in 2022, and I made this series of 5 rotating sculptures as kind of bite-sized versions of that tabletop piece in the gallery. And it was particularly important that these were at Art Dubai because I was showing with the gallery that was placed in the digital section, but I had an incredibly physical object. And so they were absolutely jokes about NFTs, because they're absolutely not NFTs. But I was really interested in seeing what would happen if they were placed within this context and doing the same thing that NFTs do, just doing a little spin, right? They're like showing how shiny and beautiful they are. So I thought they were wonderful little jokes. And they have a lateral color change, which means that the color completely shifts from front to back. So the tabletop will, they turn like a cake presentation at a diner, like a preview of a 3D file, a jewelry display, obviously NFT, like I said. So there's this highlighting of the reflective refractions of the material, and this relationship to render digital surfaces is something I think a lot about. And of course, as I mentioned before, all of my objects are made from PLA, so there's this continued link to material and content in all of the work. And there's this wonderful complication that happens with photographs or videos of my work, and they often resemble their original form. They resemble the rendering. And I love when people ask whether an image is physical or digital, and the line being properly blurred means that I've done a good job. This is the most recent iteration of the rotator table from my show in 22 with Postmasters gallery. And this was Heat Sink, which was an important title. It referenced both estrus, but also an important component of a 3D printer, a heat sink. So this was a culmination of my practice in many different forms, ways of making, ways of understanding digital objectness. So using both exposed and coated 3D printed sculptures to imitate and feign these impossible reflections found in renderings. Heatsink finally gave me the chance to merge a lot of these different bodies of work and have them be in direct conversation with one another. Roberta Smith of the New York Times described the show as the plastic sublime, and her final line was, "Take that, Jeff Koons," so I must be doing something right. This piece was very much a skewed pair of legs. If you look at it really carefully, you can see kind of inverted body, and these legs have been turned into almost the sail form in the back of the gallery. This is another show. This was from Vienna, and this was particularly important because, of course, necessity is the mother of invention. So the logistics of a show in another continent led me to some new different outputs, and I started bringing resin printing into my practice. So these are resin printed discs, and they're quite thin, relatively speaking. A lot of my work is too massive, full of mass. And so I was thinking about what are ways that I can condense the mass of these objects. And the title of this exhibition was Collected Trot, which is a reference to the practice I spent the first 20 years of my life dedicated to, which was horseback riding. And also there are some horse forms hidden in here. Every now and again, we got a hoof in the middle right there. This is one of my favorite pieces from the show. I hope I get to see this piece again. It's still in Austria, but it's a cyborg arm that's sprouting these garlic scapes instead of wires. So it's kind of like, you know, if an arm was ripped off of whatever weird cyborg form, and it has these beautiful twisty garlic scapes extending from the back. And I show you this image to think about these little guys on the table, because they're a series of fruit slices arranged into flowers, so using the fruit slices as the petals of a flower, which is particularly important because flowers are the reproductive parts of a plant. Of course, they allow pollination to take place, and pollination, of course, transfer of pollen, but that means that the flower can develop a fertilized embryo, so it becomes a fruit. Pollination is what allows fruit to arrive. So these sculptures are an inversion of that process. And perhaps your last vegetable fact of the night, maybe? Broccoli. Did you know? Broccoli. Broccoli is a flower. It's not a vegetable at all, it's a flower. Broccoli is made up of thousands of tiny flowers. If you leave a broccoli head on the plant long enough, you're gonna have little, beautiful yellow flowers. So, you might not know your vegetables quite as well as you suspect. And the last couple pieces I will show you, these are some more recent rotators. This is a thorn leg inspired by the blackberry thorns I spent the summer pruning and being pricked by. And I was also interested in the parallel to leg hair, so thinking about leg hair and thorns as protection. And in this case, this is another rotator. These are two images of the same object, just in different states of rotation. And it's very difficult to see. Well, maybe not, because this image is huge. But you can sort of see that the seeds are turning into little fingertips, the strawberry seeds. And then on the very top, there's a rosebud set of nails, kind of doing a little squeeze. So I'll move into a little bit more collaborative work. These pieces are from a collaboration with Alphonse Pierre, who's a Parisian fashion designer. This was for Paris Fashion Week in February 2024. And we worked together to design these forms, which was a combination of sculptural wearable objects and couture clothing. The motion of the models as they walked became a really important aspect of how these forms behave. This piece specifically will be in an exhibition in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris next year. And this was the piece that I was most excited about because it's hinged on using the kinetic using the kinetic motion, the kinetic energy of the model to actually shift the form. So this was completely printed out of TPU, which is a rubber material, and so it's super bouncy. So as the model walks, all of these flowers kind of shift and bounce around their head, which is really exciting. And this is the most recent collaboration we have. This was from September, and I made this kind of rubberized early iMac, and then also a video that was embedded on the tablet in front. So kind of moving around this virtual reality environment that the model was wearing. Another commission from this year, this is a disco ball. It's commissioned by the 24-Hour Drum Festival in Hudson NY. That's a really, really wonderful festival. It's a full, continuous 24 hours of music nonstop. So it becomes this wonderful experience of being in community with all these other people who are mostly staying the night in this giant room. And there's so much collaboration within this festival because each set bleeds into the next set. So the musicians are collaborating, and then also my object got to live above it all, which was incredible. So as the lighting conditions changed and the performers engaged with the space in different ways, my work was in kind of constant collaboration and triangulation with these things. And this was so exciting because when sculpture can live on its own in the world separately from its maker, it's a real delight. And I feel like this object kind of had a life of its own and had an audience that was completely separate from me, which was wonderful. And also was in all kinds of different lighting conditions. The sound was interacting with it. But I was primarily interested in how this slowly rotating form of this going 1 RPM, so 1 rotation per minute, super, super, super slow, would be constantly changing and provide this central, gentle focus of the entire festival. So a couple images from my most recent solo show. This was in Charleston, South Carolina, at Redux Art Center. And I was interested in building on these rotator forms that I had started with the drone piece. These objects were lit with colored light at night. During the day you couldn't see because there was a giant plate glass window in the front, so you could only really see this at night. But it really deepened the refractions of the crystals and also the filaments and made these ever-deepening, multi-complicated color refractions. And I've become super excited by this orb form. All of the orbs on this piece are 3D printed resin, and they actually slightly change color depending on how the light hits them. So are they an ovum? Are they a fruit? I don't know, you decide. But actually they're the same, so good. And on the walls around these pieces, there were images of these morphed screenshots from digital rendering processes to provide deeper context to the digital forms. So during my processes of rendering these objects, I would take screenshots, I would take textures and images and just all kinds of visual information, which I've been collecting for years, and then recombine them into these digital collages that then lived in the space, printed on wallpaper. But each of them had a sculpture on the surface. So there was this false light of the rendering and then the true physical object with the complicated refractions of filament. This is a little sneak preview of a commission I'm currently working on. This is for the Albany airport. If you fly out of Albany next year, or anytime starting next year for the next 10 years, you can visit this piece, which will be pretty cool. So this is a twisted kind of tangle of roots or branches. It's coming down from the ceiling, and the wall space down here, this is not the final emerald, but just pretend it looks really good. But it's something like this. There'll be like a wallpaper print, and then also these this like log and these stumps. And I didn't know until after they accepted me for the commission that it's actually for a children's play area, which is really cool actually, because I think the children of the Albany airport are going to have a wonderful time looking at all these shinies and immersing themselves into these really complicated digitally derived spaces. But it also means that these things on the floor have to be child-proof, which I'm learning a lot about. I think I figured it out, but it's taking some time. So I'm really excited to develop an indoor public installation. It's the first time I've done something like this. I've done a lot of outdoor work, I've done a lot of indoor gallery work where people can't touch things, but this is an interesting collision of these worlds. Of course, nobody will be able to touch the hanging sculpture, but everything at grabbing level and below will have to be secured and safe, but also interesting and exciting. And that's the difficulty and the dilemma. Often public work is not particularly interesting and exciting. So I'm also super grateful that the curator of the Albany Airport has as much faith in creating super engaging installations for the public that she's willing to go through all of this dilemma. And also, I wish for patience with all the logistical meetings associated with this, because in my own practice, I can do whatever I want, whenever I please. So it's also an interesting thing to meter out your practice over the course of 10 plus meetings with engineers and people who know nothing about art. So a good learning experience for me, always learning. So I'm gonna switch gears into inputs. This is a little final moment where I'm gonna tell you what feeds my brain, what I'm interested in, what I look at to make these things. I'm often asked about my research, my references, my inspiration. Careful observation is my primary mode of research. And I think that's true for many, many artists. My garden and my yard are really important to me, but I'm also looking carefully everywhere I go. I love frogs. I think frogs are wonderful. I have a little frog pond right behind my house, and I spend quite a lot of time reading and observing the frogs. They're such strange and wonderful beings. But also looking very carefully at plant and other life around me, and doing my best to notice small, strange things, because those are the things that so much meaning can be embedded into. Also reading. Reading is important. Fiction and short stories are really important to me. I get a lot of titles and poetics and ways of thinking from these structures because people who are writers obviously have a better capacity for language than I do. I'm a sculptor, so look to the experts. Also, the histories of produce are really important to me. You see this wonderful book here, Corn, A Global History. If you like food histories, you should look at the Edible series. It's by Reaction Press out of London. They have like 50 plus books, and each one is about a specific food item. I'm talking like from salt to barbecue, you got it all. So it's wonderful. If you are a person who's interested in a specific food history, get in there. Wild Fruits of Borneo is perhaps the most expensive book I've ever purchased, but it's so beautiful. I love it so very much. It's just this guy who went around Borneo for like 5 years. He actually was born there, but then he was like, I'm gonna do this book. I'm gonna go around Borneo and I'm gonna take pictures of every single fruit I see and then make them into a book. And it has to be a small press stick, but it's a delight. I love it so deeply. What else do we have up here? Ways of Being, highly recommend. Ways of Being is kind of a expanded, political, artistic journey of understanding how different digital and organic biological structures have more intersections than we believe. And yeah, I'll leave it with that. The Julio Torres picture book is really wonderful as well. I want to be a base. If you haven't looked at one of those, you should definitely find one to see in person. And fashion and music are really important to me. They're things that I look very closely at and try to think about in relationship to my own practice, my own person, and then also in thinking about how to translate ideas across different ways of making. Sometimes I think about a sculpture and I want it to feel like something sounds. My show I did at Postmasters, I really wanted it to look like it came from Dorian Electra's world, for example. So these cross-pollination moments are very important in thinking about how art making can expand out in the world. And the last thing I'll mention is Material Girls. It's the collective that I'm a part of. We've been working together for 8 years now, and it's a flexible, non-hierarchical collective dedicated to building community and fostering collaboration and opening up space through programming. I'd love to dive deeper on the work we've done together, but I'll save that for another day. You can find us in all the regular places, including our website, materialgirls.org. This is from a 2023 show at James Madison University in Virginia. We had a residency at Storm King Art Center in August of this year, and we have a show at Turley Gallery in Hudson coming up too, which will be wonderful. So if you're in Hudson in January or February, come by and check it out. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Questions? Who wants to kick it off?
Gracelee, you can call on folks.
Oh, hi, yeah.
You haven't called feedback?
Oh, do I have your? Oh, you're gonna get on the spot with fruit. Okay, I got a fruit back for you. So, this year I grew purple beans for the first time. Very beautiful, gorgeous. Love a purple bean. If you ever see them, grab them, munch them. But when you cook a purple bean, they turn green. They do not stay purple. I'm gonna think of some more fruit facts and vegetable facts, but that's the first thing that came to mind. Yes. Anyone else have other, yeah?
You said for some of your sculptures you've done work with copper. Is that like used to be printed? Is it like printed using like copper filament, or is it used in another way?
Yeah, so what I've done, because of copper casted objects being difficult and expensive to manage, is that there are actually printer filaments that are embedded with tiny particles of that metal. So there's iron, there's steel, there's copper, there's bronze, and it's not 100% that material, but there's enough of that material that you can polish and patina it to a degree. So it's a little bit more expensive than a regular PLA, but relatively speaking, not that wild. But in that case, I was using a 3D printed copper filament that had the embedded pieces of the material within the plastic. It's a pretty fun thing to play with. I mean, there's embedded wood filaments, there's all kinds of different stuff out there. But basically, it's just the base plastic, and then they've added up to whatever the level of completely decreasing the stability of that filament, whatever additional material in fabric form.
Can you talk a little bit about the longevity of some of the materials that you're using, given that they're compostable?
Sure. Well, I haven't had any signs that my objects are degrading or changing. I even have a piece that I've had outside for almost 2 years, and it really has not changed. The color has significantly changed. The form has not changed, but that's to be expected. I mean, unless the pigment is wildly coated or it's a UV averse pigment, it will end up changing. So I've not had any issues with that. When I do work that I know is going to live outdoors, I'm taking many more intense and different precautions, often coating it, doing fiberglass, things like that, or working in a completely different method, like the glass bead objects that have a great capacity for longevity outside. So if a PLA printed object is kept under the conditions of an art object, there really shouldn't be any issues. I mean, it's the same of like, you wouldn't put a painting in water, you wouldn't put a sculpture in water, unless it's supposed to be in that. So it's not something that I have run up against as an issue, but I've only been working in this technology for about 10 years. So we'll see what happens after that. But other friends and colleagues that I know who are working in the same materials also haven't reported back with any immediate issues. The thing about the compostable filament is that it's compostable if you keep it at 150 degrees for 3 months. So compostable, but, you know. So in normal circumstances, an object will not be brought to that level. And in terms of it naturally composting outdoors, so having some temperature fluctuation, being exposed to humidity, et cetera, it can take between 100 and 1,000 years. So it's not a quick process at all. So of course there's some potential for material change, and if it gets super hot, it's going to deform, but that's the case with many, many other objects. So I don't necessarily think of it wildly differently than other things, unless it's made of like steel or bronze or something.
Well, further to that question, are you designing for those eventualities for the material to potentially degrade as part of this process of being or amounts of environment?
Oh, well, everything that's outside is designed in the same way that you build a car or a boat.
Yeah.
You know, those are like, they're set, they're good to go.
But you haven't designed that in yourself yet, or as part of your process.
I don't know if I understand your question.
You could, I was just wondering whether you would consider designing the degradation into the actual work as part of the time that the work spends being. Is that something you've considered?
No, I haven't considered that. That's a really interesting direction. Yeah, I mean, I recognize that in the kind of human life scale term, they're probably not going to change a wild amount. And in my mind, deep archival circumstances past that are outside of my control, you know? But I'm really interested in that idea of, you know, what would happen if an object is designed to either degrade in a certain way or be reproducible in a certain way. You know, what if it's left with files that could be recreated? I mean, there are so many different potentials around that, but no, I haven't endeavored that line of thought yet.
Well, it's a conversation.
Yes, indeed, indeed it is.
I was curious at what point the color comes into your process, or like how is it, in some cases, I imagine it varies from project to project, but whether it's there from the start, or it's something that kind of comes in after the form, or, because there's such a range, right? I was really enjoying, some have those kind of grids, and then some have little stripes, and then sometimes you mentioned like a kind of formal connection, like citrus, I think, but I was curious, just if there's other examples or other ways that that happens, because it's such an exciting sort of span of possibilities.
Yeah, it's something I've been playing with a lot for the past couple of years, and thinking about the way that a pattern applied to a form, kind of like the way that a dazzle shift works, can completely change our understanding of how the form behaves. And how color and contrast and, like color theory is essentially, can also change how we understand the topography of an object. And so I've been playing with that and kind of pushing those ideas of discordance. I'm much more interested in discordance now than behaving well, I suppose. So like the checkerboard pieces that are all the same color family or color world, those are behaving in a much more expected way, and those were quite early in my experiments with using this direct color printing. And at this point I'm more interested in what happens when I let a little bit more chance or like chaos into the way that I'm dealing with color. So I have a huge selection of filaments. I'll keep like 100+ filaments in my studio of all different colors at any time. And I think about that as my palette. So I'll know which component I'm going to print, but then I'm trying to be more responsive with each component in looking at what I have available and kind of using that as my guidepost, I suppose. I'm thinking about what I've already printed, and instead of having everything laid out, I'm interested in this, in a little bit more chance. It's not that much chance because I ordered the filament, right? I know sort of what's there, but I'm trying to be a little bit less like hyper-controlled with it and allow for more of an unknown set of arrangements. And that also has to do with the direction it's printed, because some are, they're gradients or they're striped, or it's one color on one side, one color on the other side. So depending on how specific or like responsive or engineered I am, there'll be a completely different outcome.
Thank you. More questions, people? What else you got?
I got a question about, I don't know even how to phrase it, but I read something this week that is about nostalgia and how nostalgia is sort of bad, basically, in art, like a lot of backwards looking. And it seems to, I guess I have that on my brain, and it seems to me that in many ways this is like, nostalgia is absent from here. It's all like aspirational, forward looking, in a really exciting way. And it's using like, what can I do with these new technologies that I have in my studio, these new ways of working? I don't know. I mean, even your sort of explicit rejection of the old male painters and whatever they do or don't have to offer, feels very refreshing. I don't know. Do you feel like you're is the explicit rejection of nostalgia something that you're
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's funny because I feel like reading legible nostalgia and internal nostalgia are really different. Like I grew up on a farm. I grew up around fruits and vegetables and labor and these questions of like commodity and distribution. So those questions are really rooted within me. I would not call them nostalgic necessarily. They're a little more complicated than that. But I do think that history is certainly, and personal history is in the work. Nostalgia's never been something I'm interested in, ever. It's not my thing. It's never been something I've been drawn to. I think that points of reference are exciting. I think that like cues can be exciting, but it's just never been something that I'm drawn to. But I have always been interested in trying to understand the connections between the body and my perception of the world, which happens to be through digital space at this time. And there might be a point where this work feels nostalgic, I don't know. You know, there might be a point where like direct 3D printed work feels really old. But right now it feels like the way that I am understanding my current consciousness and view of the world, which is important to me. More questions?
Any
Can I
last
ask me anything?
questions?
Group facts.
More fruit facts. Oh, somebody shout out a fruit. I'll see if I got a fact. Kiwi. Oh, okay, I do know something about kiwis. Ooh, okay.
And what?
No, you can't what? They're so round. Kiwi fruits. There's a special kind of kiwi fruit. It's called a golden kiwi. You ever seen one? Anyone? Yes? Okay, good. Golden kiwis are patented. Patented. Okay? Not everybody can grow a golden kiwi. They are so precious and important of a commodity in New Zealand and Australia too, that only a few farms are granted access to the patents to grow golden kiwis. There's a kiwi fact. Okay, wait, one more. That was really fun. Another fruit.
Thickleberry.
Oh, I don't know anything about that one.
Starfruit.
Star fruit. Okay, I'm failing. I don't know anything about star fruit, except it's so bruised in supermarkets here. I don't think it travels that well, but it's very beautiful. A beautiful guy.
What about apples?
Apples. Ooh, apples are good. All right, apples will be my last one. So, the Northeast, we're like really an apple territory up here. It's real apple-y. Got apples on. If you use your cell phone, that I know is probably in your hand at this time, you can Google oldie names for apples. There are so many and they're so weird. Because like every little crossroads would develop a new apple because apples, very strangely, so say, I'm complicating the path, but it's okay, I'm coming to it. Take an apple. A lot of seeds in an apple. Plant a seed from that apple. You're gonna get a completely new apple. Apples do not do a direct genetic reproduction. There always is a mutation. That's why grafting is so important in apple breeding. Because if you want your Granny Smith, just like it's always a Granny Smith, you gotta do a graft. Rather than plant a seed. So there are these wonderful archives of all these different names of old apples because every farmer would be like, I've got the new old Johnny Gold Cash or whatever, and they'd make these really absurd names for the apples. So Google that, you're gonna like that. Yeah. Also the ludicrous is perhaps the best apple. That's an actual apple type also. You should find one. Thank you for indulging me with your fruit questions.
Well, that seems like a beautiful place to end our session.